Good morning, everyone, from Washington, D.C. I'm Gavin Helf, and I'm a senior expert on Central Asia at USIP, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Just on a logistical note, we invite all of you to take part in today's discussion by asking questions using the chat box function located just below the video player on the USIP events page. We ask that you please include your name and specify where you are joining us from in your questions. You can also interact with us and each other on our Twitter feed at hashtag USIP Central Asia. As many of you know, USIP was founded by the US Congress 35 years ago as an independent, nonpartisan national institute with the goal of preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. Our work in Central Asia with the U.S. State Department is through the C5+1 initiative, which provides a format for dialogue and a platform for joint efforts to address common challenges faced by the United States and the 5 countries of Central Asia. It's been just under 2 years since the U.S. State Department publicly rolled out the United States strategy for Central Asia, covering a period from 1919 to 2025. The 6-point strategy placed particular emphasis on supporting Afghanistan and democracy in the region, increasing regional connectivity, reducing regional terrorist threats, and promoting greater U.S. investment in Central Asia. Any strategy requires flexibility in a complex and changing world, but these past 2 years in Central Asia have brought some very big changes throughout the region. Just a month after this rollout, of course, COVID-19 hit the region, put massive stress on every country's government, but really did test the relationship between the governments and the people in all 5 Central Asian republics. Then soon after that, in October 2020, after a bungled parliamentary election, protests in Kyrgyzstan led to the departure of President Jeenbekov and the rise of President Japarov, and what appears to be the erosion of the democratic experiment in Kyrgyzstan. Then in April of 2021, a border war broke out between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, highlighting the frightening rise of competing nationalisms in the region and the first actual military clash between 2 countries in the region. Of course, everyone knows last August, the withdrawal of American troops and the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan created a very different dynamic in terms of regional security that left a real vacuum and probably requires a little bit of thought. And then finally, we have the recent events in Kazakhstan, including the precedent-setting deployment of CSTO troops in the region. All of these are really important developments to consider in the light of the American strategy. So to help us understand how these events affect the U.S. strategy in the region, we've got an excellent panel today to discuss the U.S. approach to Central Asia and what possibility there are following these recent developments. But first, I would like to introduce Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Leslie Vigoury, who will provide some framing remarks for us. Les is the State Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central Asia and Pakistan Affairs within the Bureau of South and Central Asia. Prior to assuming this role, he was Minister Counselor for Political Affairs in New Delhi, previously served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and in Washington as the Director of Europe and Asia for the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau and Director for Central Asia and the South and Central Asia Bureau. So no stranger to the region. And with that, I would like to hand it over to you, Das Vigoury.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Gavin. I'm grateful to join many distinguished voices today, many of whom I know, to comment on the past, present, and future of our strategic engagement with Central Asia. As you noted, it's been an eventful year in Central Asia, a region of strategic importance to the United States, and one playing an ever greater role in global affairs. The fall of Kabul on August 15th has had a huge effect on the region, as Central Asian states have expressed concern about their own security and wait and watch Taliban actions. The events of early January in Kazakhstan were surprising to all. Sorry, slight glitch here. But they do emphasize the need for economic and social reforms. We're all watching Russia's aggressive actions towards Ukraine. But some sense of perspective is also in order. We've celebrated the 30th anniversaries of the Central Asian states' independence, as well as the anniversaries of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and the nations of Central Asia. The United States was among the first to welcome the independence of Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Many things have changed over the past few decades, but our overarching goals remain the same. Our commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the countries in the region has not changed. We continue to believe that political pluralism and democratic governance are the foundational bedrock for a free and prosperous society. Through sustained bilateral engagements and regional cooperation, we continue to advance the rule of law, promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and fight corruption. With that as a foundation, we've shown over the years a flexibility to change as we look to build stronger bilateral and regional partnerships. Take, for example, our relationship with Uzbekistan. It's not an overstatement to say that our relations have never enjoyed such depth and breadth. This past December, Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs Don Liu and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor Kara McDonald traveled to Tashkent and took part in our two nations' inaugural strategic partnership dialogue. At this forum, in our regular dialogues and annual bilateral consultations with other Central Asian states, we offered our assistance in meeting many of these countries' stated political, economic, and human rights goals. Central Asia, it's our belief, Central Asia is at its strongest when regional cooperation allows its states to work together to address the challenges they share. Whether we are addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, or disinformation campaigns, regional cooperation yields better results for society as a whole. We're committed to using the C5+1 platform as a vehicle to encourage regional integration and greater openness to the outside world as we work with our Central Asian partners to address the most pressing regional challenges. Secretary Blinken hosted a C5+1 ministerial in April 2021, powerfully signaling to the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration the importance the United States places on Central Asia. That ministerial set the stage for a series of high-level C5+1 engagements throughout 2021 that addressed our shared policy priorities, including with National Security Advisor Liz Sherwood-Randall on economic connectivity in Tashkent in July, with Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change John Kerry on climate, energy, and environment in September, and with Secretary Blinken again on the margins of UNGA regarding regional security in Afghanistan. Indeed, support for the Afghan people remains a key regional effort for the United States and our Central Asian partners. We've worked long and hard to enhance regional connectivity, economic integration, and energy linkages between Central Asia and Afghanistan. We hope that key regional connectivity investments and trade projects that can benefit the region as a whole will continue, though much will depend on the Taliban's intentions. Our Central Asia strategy is focused on the long-term prosperity, sovereignty, and strategic autonomy of our Central Asian partners. Nothing exemplifies this more than our efforts to expand and improve opportunities for the next generation of Central Asian leaders. Throughout the region, we have significantly invested in supporting education reforms, expanding English language opportunities, and facilitating higher education partnerships. Since 2017, we have helped establish 70 university partnerships between Central Asian and American institutions of higher education on topics ranging from agricultural economics to public administration. These partnerships are working to improve higher education in Central Asia and equip Central Asian students with 21st century skill sets. This month, we awarded 10 new partnership grants to specifically bolster regional collaboration and learning concerning our most pressing energy and environmental challenges. Recent events in Kazakhstan remind us of the importance of addressing the underlying social and economic factors that can lead to instability. That's why we will continue to engage and urge the governments of Central Asia to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, address economic inequality, and combat corruption. We also continue to highlight with our Central Asian partners the positive role that civil society can play in examining the root causes of economic and social frustrations. Today, I've only touched the surface of our deep and continuing engagement with the region, but I hope I've made it clear that contrary to the mistaken belief that we are losing interest, the United States is invested in Central Asia and focused on policies that help promote a stable and secure region, which deepens cooperation with the United States and the world. We will tailor our engagement to reflect the realities on the ground, but we are guided by the enduring principle that the sovereignty and independence of our Central Asian partners is a foreign policy goal and interest of the United States. The path will not always be smooth, and ample challenges remain, but we believe our bilateral relations with Central Asian states and efforts to enhance regional cooperation are on an upward trajectory. Thank you, and I look forward to listening to a thoughtful discussion.
Thank you, Les. Now I want to turn to our panel, very distinguished panel. I will ask a couple of rounds of questions before turning to the audience, and we very much want to engage with the audience. I want to remind you that you can take part in today's discussion by asking questions using the chat box function just below the video player on the USIP event page. But first, let me introduce briefly our panelists. First, we have Ambassador Richard Hoagland, who is currently the Security and Politics Program Director Chair at the Caspian Policy Center. Ambassador Hoagland retired after 30 years of distinguished service as a Foreign Service officer. He served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia Affairs, and quite importantly, Ambassador to Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Charge d'Affaires to Turkmenistan. We also have Jennifer Murtazashvili, who is the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets and associate professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on issues of self-governance, security, political economy, and public sector reform in the developing world. She is a longtime commentator on Afghanistan and a former Peace Corps volunteer from Uzbekistan. We have Frederick Starr, who is the founding chairman of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program. Fred has written extensively on Central Asia and Afghanistan over decades. He was the founding chairman of the Kennan Institute in Washington and served as the vice president of Tulane University and president of the Aspen Institute and of Oberlin College. Navbahor Imanova is a prominent multimedia journalist for Voice of America's Uzbek service. As an anchor, reporter, multimedia editor, and producer, she has covered the relationship between Central Asia and the United States for over 20 years on TV, radio, and online. Since 2018, she has also been reporting from the inside of Uzbekistan as the first ever US-based accredited correspondent in the country. And finally, Don Jensen is the director for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Don writes extensively on Russian domestic politics and foreign policy priorities and security policies. He also specializes in the domestic and foreign policies of other post-Soviet states, especially Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states. So I'll start with a round of questions for all of you that basically is the title of today's event. Does the U.S. strategy for Central Asia address the region's current problems? And I'll start with Ambassador Hoagland.
Well, thank you very much, Gavin, and thank you so much to USIP for this very important program. If you've read the public version of the U.S. strategy for Central Asia 2020 to 2025, it's quite reasonable, and it doesn't really differ dramatically from earlier versions. I've read the classified version that is much, much longer, and in that version, it's Russia, China, Russia, China, Russia, China. But it seems to me it's more descriptive than prescriptive, our policy. And in some ways, that's okay. But the problem is that in diplomacy, the crisis of the day takes precedence. And our high-minded ideals too often get left behind in the filing cabinet and overtaken by public events. Now, our basic policy for the region really hasn't changed in 30 years. It's to support the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the independent former Soviet socialist republics. At the beginning of the first decade of the independence of these new countries, the undercurrent in US policy in Washington was that surely they would become free market democracies, if only we could offer enough assistance. But they didn't. And in retrospect, that's not in the least bit surprising. They had lived through 70 years of the Soviet Empire, and before that, several hundred years of the Tsarist Empire, most of them with very, very little contact with the West. And even before that, especially in Central Asia, they'd been Turkic Mongol Khanates or nomadic societies. That means that none had the cultural and political backgrounds that in the West are grounded in the Renaissance, the Reformation, and especially the Enlightenment. The ways of the West were utterly foreign to them. Whereas in the West, policy tends to promote the rights of the individual, the political systems in these countries focus on an autocratic and sometimes hereditary leader to whom citizens pay taxes, bribes, and near total obeisance. And yet, without understanding this deeply embedded history, some in Washington were increasingly disappointed that they hadn't become like us once they had the choice. Now, each of these countries has matured remarkably. Each, in its own way, works hard to balance its relationships with Russia, China, the European Union, and the United States. Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared this region part of Russia's special sphere of influence. And at times, he's upped the adjective from special to exclusive. Russia would not be at all displeased to see the West, and especially the United States, lose interest in the region, pack up its bags, and go home. In fact, in the most recent Washington-Moscow negotiations, it's becoming ever more clear that Putin wants to close a new Iron Curtain. Over the years, China has become a key partner for most of the countries in the region, especially with its Belt and Road Initiative. And what we're seeing now, as almost always happens, hard power follows soft power. And Beijing is starting to develop a military presence in the region. The European Union has maintained a steady, if rather low-key interest in the region, and regularly announces an updated political and economic plan for the countries. The question now, post-Afghanistan, is what will the United States do? An undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the various levels of governance and human rights problems in most of the countries has strongly motivated one faction of the foreign policy community in Washington to urge the United States to dial back its relations with these countries because we don't need them anymore. That would be an historic mistake. Each of these countries, each in its own way, depends on the United States. And as a new generation comes to power in these countries, people who have studied in the West and now regularly do business with Western companies, inevitably, they will further internationalize these countries that only 30 years ago were still isolated socialist republics. I suggest we need to have patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hoagland. I want to turn to Jin Murtazashvili, again with the broader question of, does the U.S. strategy for Central Asia address the region's current problems?
Gavin, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and really just amongst such esteemed colleagues. It's just a real honor to be able to have this conversation. And so the brief answer to your question is no. The current strategy does not address Central Asia's current realities. And of course, we can talk about the Afghanistan issue separately, and I know that we'll do that a little later on. But as Ambassador Hoagland said, as someone who didn't have access to the classified version of the strategy, you can see not only Russia, China written all over that strategy, but you also see Afghanistan written directly into it. And so with those changing dynamics, I think it is a really good opportunity right now for the U.S. to fundamentally rethink how the U.S. is seeing this region. And I think the U.S. can play a very constructive role in Central Asia, but has to meet Central Asia where it is, understand the needs and the desires of these independent republics, understand where their goals, and understand where, how the U.S. can balance its own interests, meeting Central Asian republics where they are. And so, we've heard for the past 30 years, sovereignty and territorial integrity, these are important pillars, pluralism, these are important pillars of U.S. strategy. But is it time to sort of move beyond this, except that sovereignty is, over 30 years, we've sort of achieved that goal of sovereignty, although there's some questions about what's happened recently in Kazakhstan for sure. But how is the U.S. adapting to this changing world? And Central Asia is such a dynamic place right now. Of course, we're focused on the conflicts, we focus on the instability that we certainly see, but these countries over the past 30 years have really moved into their own. They have their own challenges, they have their own structures of governance, they have their own dynamic economies. And we really need to understand where those interests overlap with U.S. interests. And I don't think that seeing this region through the lens of Russia or seeing through the lens of China really helps us do that. We can't be reactive to what other countries are doing. I think the United States has to be proactive and put forward a very positive strategy that really meets Central Asia where it is. And, despite this deep history that Ambassador Hoagland has pointed out, there has been incredible and very rapid learning in this region. And so we're dealing with very young populations that are not post-Soviet. Using that term post-Soviet, I think has been a real hindrance for the way that Washington sees Central Asia. I do think Washington was quite forward-leaning in moving Central Asia out of the Europe and Eurasia Bureau and moving it into South Asia. I think that was a very wise and forward-looking move, but I think the United States really has to do more to congeal those kinds of relationships. And so it's its own dynamic region. And we've talked about some of the unfortunate events that have swept Central Asia in recent weeks and months. And if we look at the driving factors that are behind many of those some of the violence and the unrest, we find economic factors. And those economic factors are almost completely absent from U.S. strategy. And that's where I would argue the opportunities really lie for U.S. engagement in the region. Of course, combating corruption, civil society, but there's a real argument to make to create space for rule of law based on the desire to open things like capital markets and investment. These are things that there are strong mutual interests among Central Asian states to develop their own economies. So Central Asia, the United States is looking for a stable and secure region, and that's what we heard the Deputy Assistant Secretary just underlie, a stable and secure region, but I would like the United States to talk more about a prosperous region. How can Central Asia become a more prosperous region? And I think it's through this economic cooperation that U.S. can best advance its own interests that include things like democracy and human rights. So putting economic interconnectivity as a real pillar of this, focusing on positive sum relations between the republics and the United States, and then having a much more proactive foreign policy that deals with things like foreign investment, science, technology, education, engaging multilaterals and international financial institutions. The United States has spoken a lot about the need to engage with the region, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of resources supporting this engagement, which is leading many to question whether the U.S. has a sustained strategy. So my university was actually one of the 10 partners to establish this regional hub that was just mentioned to connect universities across Central Asia. And we're really engaged on a new project that focuses on economic development and public administration. And so I think public administration and this intersection between economic development and public administration is really one of the key drivers that the United States should be engaged in, because without reforms in these areas, as we know, it'll be difficult for Central Asian republics to achieve their own goals, right, of economic prosperity. And just want to leave with one thing, is that this hub that we're creating is really based on the pillar of education. And education is really the one thing, I mean, if we can talk about where the biggest demand for U.S. engagement in the region is right now, it's in education. And it's something that all governments in the region really share as a desire. And I think this is another issue that should really be the heart of a very positive strategy for the future of Central Asia. So Central Asia has a very young population. Let's create a young strategy that sort of sweeps, understands, that's based in the past, understands the past, but really turns the page into a new era.
Thank you, Jen. I want to turn to Fred with the same question. Does U.S. strategy for Central Asia address the region's current problems? Although I know the question that you'd prefer that I ask is, does the U.S. have a strategy in Central Asia? So over to you, Fred. Fred, you're muted. You've got to unmute. Yeah.
I salute Les Figuri for giving a very responsible overview of its implementation. It's an impressive list. In fact, it's a laundry list. It is a grab bag. We are like the old Fuller Brushmen of old who show up at your door with a big packet that they open. Do you want this? This is what we're offering. It's so broad that nothing is more important than anything else. There are those who argue, and I respect them very highly, for the importance of democracy, strengthening democratic government. But if one is really taking that seriously, isn't it necessary to ask what are the preconditions, country by country, that foster that? And certainly economic development, as we've just heard, can be an element of it, but not necessarily. Another one, though, that they would all agree on is that if our sovereignty, our capacity for self-government is weakened, then forget about the rest of your smorgasbord. Forget about the rest of your large program of very laudable activities. They disappear into the mist in the priorities of the countries themselves if we're not addressing the issue of sovereignty and security. Now, unfortunately, that is constantly threatened. It's an interesting point. It's nice to be able to consider this region without its big neighbors, but from the standpoint of it's very central, and those who would push it aside elsewhere, East China Sea and so forth, are missing one obvious point, and that is this is the only region square in the middle between China and Iran. These are all major concerns of the U.S. Afghanistan will continue to be, as Jen has indicated, I think it's right. Here we are right in the middle of it all. And so that calls for a very serious American strategy, one in which everything is not equal, in which we understand what depends upon what. And that's where we failed. And you can say that's implementation, you can say it's in the strategy itself, but it's a failure. And let me say that in the eyes the countries we're speaking about, and by the way, on this issue, I would add definitely Azerbaijan as well, in their eyes, the issues of sovereignty, self-governance, etc., those come first. These are the sine qua non. These are the things that must be there if the other things are going to be there. And that's where we've come up short. It's interesting, Gavin, I don't mean to be critical, but you didn't mention security in your list of our goals at the beginning. It should be number one, and it's now. Why isn't it? Because it's parceled out into other parts of the USG. We have the Defense Department. We have a set of agreements there which are or are not figuring in this discussion. For example, the Partnership for Peace with NATO. That was a serious enterprise. It involved the Central Asian Battalion. It involved interaction with the leadership of every, except for Turkmenistan, all the militaries of the region. Have we heard a word about that? Seriously under threat? No. And are we volunteering to bring forward this question? I'm not suggesting this or that action. I'm suggesting a discussion with the countries that honestly includes security, sovereignty, self-governance, and self-determination. That's what's been missing. That's what we could put into the formula. And if we were to do so, then all these other laudable initiatives that we've undertaken will have some meaning instead of being just isolated good things.
All right, thank you, Fred. And finally, I want to turn to Navbahor with the first question: does the U.S. strategy for Central Asia address the region's current problems? Navbahor?
Hello, everybody. It's great to be with this panel. Really honored. I have known you for a long time. I follow your work. I rely on your expertise in my work every day. So it's really nice to have this opportunity to share my observations and thoughts about what the United States gets and doesn't get about Central Asia. I would like to really focus on that today. Any strategy, as we know, requires awareness. I would argue that Central Asians definitely know more about the United States today than ever. Hundreds of thousands of Central Asians now live in this country, which I think also requires some focus. I think Uzbek Americans, Kazakh Americans, Kyrgyz, Tajik, Turkmen Americans are increasingly vocal, and I think Washington needs to also engage them when it's considering, to renew its strategy. When I came to the United States 20 years ago and had just started doing my master's in Indiana at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, 9/11 had just happened, and I was just starting to work with the Voice of America as a stringer, and I decided to do this little survey on campus among ordinary American students and professors about how much they knew about Central Asia, let alone about individual, countries. And I remember talking to about 30 people, and only 3 of them, 2 professors and 1 student, knew something about the region. And they tied it to Afghanistan because the United States was just opening air bases in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and Americans were fighting in Afghanistan, were starting to fight in Afghanistan. And that factor has not changed because, I've constantly inquired about this. I constantly ask Americans about how much they know wherever I travel about the region, and you hear Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Afghanistan. And that in many ways also reflects, U.S. strategy towards the region, at least for the last 20 years. And I've covered 4 administrations now in Washington since 2003. And as Deputy Assistant Secretary Les Vigoury mentioned, the principles and objectives have stayed the same. And, that's the focus on the support of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of these countries. Why has American policy stayed basically the same over the last 20 years when the region has, in fact, changed? A lot, some argue. And when Central Asians ask that question, I like to challenge them back by saying how much really, changed in Central Asia, especially in terms of governance and freedom. But when Americans ask that question, I also like to challenge them about why Washington isn't really changing its stand on Central Asia, since some things have at least changed. And I think as a journalist, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Voice of America here, overall, based on my conversations, especially in the region, I think these 2 questions really are really crucial here. How much has changed? Let's talk about that. And also, is the United States adapting sufficiently to those things? If the fact, if some things have changed. One consistent argument I hear from American policymakers is that, long-term objectives should drive U.S. policy. It's all about the big picture. And as Ambassador Hoagland mentioned, we don't know the classified version of the strategy. And people at the Pentagon and even at the State Department and other parts of the U.S. government may be thinking, hey, we're succeeding. You just don't know about it. Because we, in fact, don't really know about it. And when you discuss U.S. strategy with Central Asians, especially the governments, for example, my conversations within the Uzbek government, they don't really complain. I mean, they're fine. Specifically, let's say like the Mirziyoyev administration, they think that the cooperation is much broader and more productive now, let's say, than 15 years ago. So I know that U.S. policymakers can list a lot of productive things that they have done over the years in the region, but I'm here to tell you that Central Asians in general see America as this giant that is focused elsewhere and frankly, not willing to do much with them. They see it as a country focused on its own interests, not theirs. They see it more focused on enlisting them in America's own competition, let's say, with China, then, let's say, focusing on first, second, and third on their needs and wants, as Jennifer mentioned. And, remember 2 years ago when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went to the region, specifically to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, he talked more about China than Central Asians themselves. So, optics matter. What people hear in media matter. So it's no surprise that Central Asians actually see the relationship with America as more transactional and largely confined to diplomacy. Now, maybe that seems unfair, but when the U.S. says its strategy is premised on trying to open the systems, develop markets, enable growth, improve the quality of education, healthcare, and life in general, the question is, well, how much is America really doing those things for us? And I don't mean to be cynical here, but they want fewer words and more action. They want more active America in the region. So the test Central Asians are going to apply here to American strategy is whether it generates options for Central Asians to have better lives. And if it does, it's a success as far as Central Asians are concerned. Otherwise, they'll just, write America off. Many want to see, as I said, a more active America, and they don't really care about what the strategy strategy says in the first place. I also hear from many Central Asians that they get that America needs to be modest and humble in its own strategy, and and metaphorically speaking, Washington shouldn't write checks that the United States isn't going to be able to cash, and they also get that U.S. needs some flexibility to maneuver. You need to be able to react to inevitable setbacks, disappointments, as well as to engage when there are openings and opportunities. And there's always this conversation, and I don't think it will ever end, in Washington or in Central Asia. What makes a successful strategy? Does every part of it needs to be successful? Is there actually a successful strategy that the United States can look at and say, hey, here is this region that we've been really doing well? We can always question the strategy. And many people think that there is no U.S. strategy for Central Asia because they don't like the tactics. So, there is strategy versus tactics. But one thing that I very often hear, especially in the region, is how strategic is the strategy if Central Asia, as Americans constantly mention to us, is such a strategic region. And actually, we constantly also hear from Washington that the relationship has been productive, especially over the last 15 years. But momentum should lead to more momentum. So, what's the next set of goals for going to be? The fact is, U.S. is limited in its ability to compete with China and Russia. That we hear a lot as well. And Central Asians in many ways get that. But I think there is this feeling in the region as well, both in the governments and among the public, that America needs a nuanced approach. And that applies to the American commitment of democracy as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I noticed, I think, in my news feed this morning that Xi Jinping is meeting with all 5 Central Asian leaders yesterday, and that
He met already. Mm-hmm.
Prime Minister Modi met with them, 2-3 days ago, all sort of, in commemoration of 30 years of relations, which is something that we're doing. I invited Don Jensen to our panel to give him a break from Ukraine for a couple of hours. So, but also because, U.S. policy is often balanced by a concern about Russian policy. I noticed that, especially over the last 3 weeks with the CSTO deployment in Kazakhstan, that a lot of observers in Central Asia see this setting a really strong precedent, for CSTO involvement and interference or Russian reassertion of its control, addressing that, primary question of sovereignty that is in every American strategy. Russia has clearly been opposing any enduring U.S. military presence over the horizon in Central Asia since last August and the withdrawal of U.S. troops. So, Don, I want to ask you what you think, how Central Asia figures in Moscow's hierarchy of fear and opportunity, to get a sense of, from a Russian perspective, how important the region is. Don, you're muted. Unmute.
Thank you for having me. I was a junior FSO with Ambassador Hoagland in Moscow 25 years ago, and he actually looks younger. Yes, I think I make a couple points. Number one, I do think the security atmosphere, the security question is higher than some of the other speakers might have given it. But let me make a couple points about the Russian perspective and Russian behavior, because I do think both Kabul and January are important benchmarks for how Russia sees the region. Number one, I think I get upset sometimes that so many people think that Russia is trying to recreate the USSR. I don't think that it is. I think that Russia is trying to reinvent itself as a great power in Eurasia, a great power around the world. And I think that means, as Mr. Hoagland said, the U.S. not in its backyard, because Russia wants the predominant influence over its neighbors. That having been said, I do think there's a much more varied approach by Moscow to its neighbors than some people give it credit for. I think Ukraine obviously is the highest priority. Opposition to NATO as well. But I think for a long time, Moscow was content to have a rather differentiated approach to the region, so long as its interests were recognized. And its interests are, I think, primarily security, but not only. It also has business interests, for example, in Kazakhstan, the Russian ethnic minority, about which there has been some concern in the past few years in Moscow, is something they follow relatively closely. So yes, the Russia wants the U.S. out. It's a security issue. It's an issue of Russia seeing itself playing a certain role in Eurasia. I pause at the phrase Iron Curtain. I prefer to think they want the U.S. out. But that does not mean necessarily that we can't cooperate on some issues. We just have to find what those are. But what else does Putin want? Putin also wants a regime preservation for Russia. And I think that's why there are so many interesting aspects to the CSTO adventure that you mentioned, Gavin. They were not peacekeepers, obviously. Moscow apparently was surprised, but these were special operations troops that do policing, that do on-call putting down unrest around, are ready to do that. But the fact that they use this for the first time, I think, in this way does set a precedent for Putin's view of what he can get away with in the region in the future. And I think that, depending on the circumstances on the ground, of course, is likely to continue. I am not one of those people who sees China as a major threat to Russian interests in the region. I think they largely work hand in glove. If Ukraine is to Russia what Taiwan might be to China, an offside in comparison, I think Central Asia thus is in the middle. And I think for now, at least, they can live with each other in their various interests without seeing a threat from the outside, and particularly from the United States. I would conclude my 5 minutes, Gavin, by saying the issue of the example of Kazakhstan to the denizens of the Kremlin, I think, was a surprise and also kind of frightening. And I think the relationship between Putin's need to tighten his grip at home and also to prevent similar so-called orange-colored revolutions in its neighbors, not just in Ukraine, but now evidently in Kazakhstan too, is something they're going to pay very close attention to, which probably portends continued Russian interference of some sort in the security dimension of these regimes. The Kazakhstan leader then becomes a very interesting figure, and for that, Gavin, I always turn to you, who know it very well. But I think they are watching the situation very closely. If, in fact, indeed, the 2,500 Russian troops who came back relatively quickly, I have no hesitation in seeing Putin repeating that there or elsewhere, should the Kremlin decide that the need dictates it. Over to you.
Okay, so keeping on the foreign policy and sort of regional context theme, I want to turn now to Jennifer with a question about Afghanistan. What do you think the return of the Taliban means for U.S. goals and even for our leverage in the region? A lot of the policy points, at least 2, if not 3 of the 6 policy priorities in the current Central Asia strategy focus on supporting the government in Afghanistan. Clearly, that's something that needs a little bit of revision. But how do you think that affects U.S. strategy going forward? Jen.
I mean, it's a fascinating time to be having this discussion, and I would agree completely. So we haven't been talking a lot about security, and I think there's a reason why. Because the U.S. has been so badly discredited in the region because of what has happened in Afghanistan. So that's why I didn't put security as sort of the #1 priority, and it would be interesting to have this kind of discussion, because is there a demand for the U.S. to have this role in the region? And I would argue, if we saw what had happened, especially over the past 6 or 7 years, let's look at northern Afghanistan. Let's look at this from the perspective of Central Asian republics. Russia was not opposed, right, to the United States' role in Afghanistan. Iran was not opposed. Many countries in the region were not opposed to the U.S. effort in Afghanistan. What changed was the train wreck of what we did there. And so over the past, since 2013, northern Afghanistan went completely downhill. Central Asian republics and Russia are looking at this saying, this is a disaster. The U.S. wants to engage with us on counterterrorism, but look at the role of terrorists in Afghanistan under the United States. And so there was a sense that the U.S. was promoting more instability, not directly, but indirectly, because it couldn't achieve its efforts in Afghanistan. And so if you're a Central Asian republic and you're looking to build stability and you're looking to build security, is the U.S. going to be number one on your list? I'm not sure. And so of course, I see Afghanistan as actually a place where there's potential positive sum relationships between Russia, China, and the United States. I think nobody wants long-term instability inside of Afghanistan. Nobody wants the growth of groups like ISIS inside of Afghanistan. Russia has been very clear about that. China has been very clear about that. The Taliban, I think, have been pretty clear about that. But the Taliban continue to, they have militants from Central Asia, and I think they keep them sort of conveniently to poke the Central Asian republics to remind them, that they have this capability. But it's also important to remember that the Central Asian republics are looking at Afghanistan and have been looking at the United States over the past 6 or 7 years. The Central Asian republics were reaching out to the Taliban. They had strong bilateral relations with the Taliban, with the exception of Tajikistan. But we don't see even Tajikistan as having, they're not cowering in the face of this new Taliban government. They're trying to work with it, trying to cooperate with it. And how can a U.S. strategy take account of this? And I think this is the big question: is what is the U.S. policy going to be towards Afghanistan? The U.S. isn't just going to, I think there's some in Washington who just want to completely ignore it and pretend it never happened. We certainly get that feeling from some in the Biden administration and even sometimes from President Biden himself. But it's clear that these issues are not going anywhere, and they're going to have long-term effects in Central Asia. And Central Asian republics are actually being quite proactive and continuing their discussions of things like CASA and TAPI and so many of the things that we have seen as being like unfathomable and like pipe dreams. Central Asian republics, they don't have time to waste, yet they continue pursuing this. And I think we have to take that a bit more seriously. So sort of refocusing we have the C5+1, what happened to all these trilaterals that we were working on in Central Asia, that focused on Afghanistan? Is Afghanistan completely gone? But having a Central Asian strategy that was so dependent on what happened in Afghanistan, I think shows us that this was a huge risk. And we weren't seeing actually the strong mutual interests that many countries in Central Asia had with Afghanistan, regardless of who is in power.
So this brings up, I'm going to segue over to Fred for a second with a question that I think is very much related to the response to Afghanistan. Fred, before COVID happened for a couple of years, you talked and wrote a lot about Central Asia, this region, as a unit of 76 million and what it could achieve as a collective force working together. How do you think this looks, the prospects for regional cooperation and sort of Central Asian solidarity after COVID, after what's happened in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan with the border skirmish, and certainly with Afghanistan and the CSTO deployment? What's your take on that? How that has evolved over the last couple of years?
Well, first of all, let's acknowledge that Central Asia is the only region in the world that doesn't have its own intra-regional organization without outsiders. There's ASEAN, there's the Nordic Council. How many do you have in the Caribbean, South America, Middle East, and so on? So not Central Asia. We should have been supporting the beginning. We've been approving it, but not doing it to foster it. But let me look at this entire security issue from their perspective, which hasn't been done here this morning. From Russia and China, yes, they have to maintain and they want to maintain cordial relations there. But to keep them in bounds, every Central Asian state, including Turkmenistan, has a that you use it's Russia, you use the West, US, Europe to balance both of them. That only works if we're playing. If we're not participating actively, supporting that balance, playing the kind of role that is serious in terms of security, which includes defense, by the way. If we're not doing that, they're stuck. All our other projects fade in importance. They become nice that the Americans can bring, but they aren't really central to our sovereignty and self-governance. Now, where does that leave us? It seems to me that we should be more embracing the regional concept. Now, you say, well, we have C5+1. It's been thin. The concept is good. Remember, it was not to Mr. Kerry by the then ambassador from Kazakhstan to the United States. They initiated. We did. Yes, they have meetings and so on and do stuff, but it's been very passive. By comparison, look, China, Russia, they're doing, and everyone else is far more active. Now, what does that mean on our side? Well, so many practical things. Do our ambassadors meet together before they go out? As a region, is there a regular meeting of regional ambassadors to identify American objectives? Do we convene Central Asian ambassadors to dinner? But I don't see the US government taking this kind of initiative. But more than that, here's the problem. We have played favorites. We up to the ones that we give good marks to on the democratization front, and we give demerits to the other. If we want a regional strategy, we have to get off that. We have to be far more patient and tenacious with those who are underperforming in areas that are important to us. But we don't just cut them off. On the contrary, that would be a sign to work with them. Why reward them only? Why rewarding them only when they cross the finish line rather than helping them cross? We're doing, and by the way, that's exactly what the Russians and the Chinese do. They play favorites, and we have to get off that game. Treat them as a region, treat them with respect, foster a regional thinking in our programs, and we have a huge. We should probably comb it out, do less and do better, and have it more closely related to our top priority, which is their top priority, by the way, and that is preservation of sovereignty and self-determination and self-governance.
You brought up democracy and truth in advertising. I spent 15 years working at USAID, mostly on Central Asia, as a promoter of democracy. So I am happy to ask this question to Nafbahor instead of trying to answer it myself. One of the very consistent stated objectives of U.S. strategy going all the way back to the Clinton administration since independence has been democracy promotion, promoting democracy, good governance, and human rights. It's been in every strategy, every strategic document. This is offered now as, originally the big path forward for countries in 1993 and 1994, but now increasingly it is really in competition with an alternative Russian authoritarian model and an alternative Chinese techno-authoritarian model. And sort of a policy of non-interference in internal affairs by SCO and other regional organizations. With Kyrgyzstan's increasingly presidentialist system since October 2020, and not a lot of democracy to be observed in the region. Nabokor, how do you think the U.S. should think about engaging on these questions?
Thank you, Gavin. The fact that none of the Central Asian countries were invited to the Summit for Democracy last month says volumes about where things are in terms of democracy in the region and how the Biden administration sees Central Asia. Pro-democracy people obviously want more from this, most powerful Western democratic partner and measure the viability of the strategy based on the democratic development in the region. So if you don't see democracy flourishing in the region, then the democracy promotion by the United States is failing. And that's what we hear constantly. If you don't see economic development as well, or media freedom, or human rights advancements in the region, then the US strategy is failing. In my reporting, to be honest, I'm yet to see some compelling arguments, though, about how to make the strategy more effective in areas like democratization or human rights with governments that are, as we know, inherently skeptical and resistant. What changes the reality on the ground is the will of the people. And we hear this, from the American policymakers as well, always. Kazakhstan, it's true that Kazakhstan tolerated Nazarbayev for 30 years. Uzbekistan lived with Karimov, glorifying him for a quarter of a century. Tajikistan has been doing that with Rahmon for nearly 30 years now. And Kyrgyzstan is going back to authoritarian ways of doing things. So things don't look good in terms of democracy development in the region. And what can U.S. do that differently compared to the last 30 years, in the face of these realities? What tools does it have? That would be my question. How much will and how much money is there to do that? I think, money matters here, right? More than anything. It always has an option to throw its arms off and walk away, or stay engaged in ways that it can with the leaderships and have at least some leverages in order to maintain the ability to express itself or, affect change to some degree. People in the region want more accountable and responsible leaders. And my question to them, especially in Uzbekistan, since this has been really debated more openly now than ever before, is that, where do these leaders come from? I always ask Uzbeks, what have you done to actually produce them? What kind of democratic investments have you made for the last 30 years to have better governance now? And the question is, what is the U.S. input in that? How could have the United States help in this process? And can it help? Does it want to help now? So without knowing the answer for those questions, we can suggest all kinds of things, right? I always push for media freedom, but those are the real issues here. And Afghanistan is a perfect example. If you have no internal drive to change or reform, or you may invest, trillions of dollars, but you won't see that. You won't see that outcome. So here the question is, do those few policymakers, a tight circle of policymakers on Central Asia, want to push harder for democratic development? So if we know the answer for that, then we can come up with a lot of suggestions and recommendations.
Kevin, a very quick note, if I may.
Yeah.
And that is, we cannot separate this issue from the issue of and self-determination. If that's their priority, if we want them to listen to our priority, we better address their priority. And that means everything, including security, military issue, what's going on. Look, I don't care if the secret version of the C5+1 or new strategy rather is unavailable. We can see what's actually being done in the security area. Nothing's being written on this. Let's get it out in the open. Let's see if we're doing anything serious. If we are, we can expect them to respond in terms of our priorities. Until we are, don't expect them to respond in anything.
So I'm going to offer our panelists a chance to two-finger or comment and rebut each other before we move to questions. Fred figured that out and anticipated it, but do any of the other panelists have comments on those? Dick?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gavin. I know our time is short, so I'm going to cut to the chase here. Within the last 6 months or so, I have been in Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, and I've talked with senior government officials there. Here's something really important. I heard it then, and actually for about the last 5 years, those countries have perceived that all the countries of the region have perceived that the United States is withdrawing from the region. They repeat that again and again and again, but we aren't. We have full-scale embassies that continue our civilian and military programs with relatively little change. But it's often true, especially in these countries, perception is reality. And I'd like to suggest it's time for the Biden administration to come up with and publicize a new and enhanced policy for this enormously strategic part of the world. The United States basically needs to be more visible in Central Asia. And the very, very first step the State Department can make is to get full-fledged U.S. ambassadors into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. We only have 3 ambassadors in the region.
Amazing.
That's it.
Jen, did you have a comment?
Yes, along these lines, sort of the democratization angle. I used to be a USAID democracy and governance officer in Tashkent during some of the darkest days, and that was not easy work. But what surprises me is that the U.S. is still using the same tools that they were using 20 years ago to promote democracy in the region. And I just think at a certain point, these strategies, these tactics actually just become sort of very empty. And, we have to understand that Russian disinformation has had a huge effect on people's understanding and perceptions of words like democracy and civil society and gender. They sound like foreign words. They sound like things coming from the outside. And the way that the U.S. sort of promotes these issues, I don't think necessarily, number one, helps promote the issue at hand, and number two, seems like a foreign policy issue rather than a domestic one. So I think if the U.S. is going to continue to do it, it has to be much smarter, really rethink how it does this kind of work. We talk so much about NGO registration. Like NGOs are sort of the pivotal point thing that we all look at, but young people don't create NGOs anymore. I mean, this is like what old people do. Let's think about like new dynamic ways that people are organizing, but yet we get so hung up on NGO registration as being the pivotal measure of civil society. Yet civil society in Uzbekistan, for example, is much more vibrant than it has been at any time in its modern history. So many young people involved in, civic activism in ways that are just not captured by our old measures. And why isn't the U.S. jumping on this and engaging it where it is, rather than using these sort of old hammers to look at this very important issue? And I would agree with Fred here, is that we have to meet these countries where they are. And if this is really important to us, yes, the security aspects are very important, but exploring how these democracy issues are so interconnected with their own goals for prosperity. And, I think that Kazakhstan understood that. And I think even if we look at what President Tokayev is saying in response to what has happened, one very positive thing I think we can take away from what's happened is his response to these events wasn't Andijan, wasn't, shutting everything off, kicking everyone out, at least for now, but is saying we're open. We continue to be open. And in fact, here are the reforms that I'm going to pursue as a result of this. Whether we believe him or not is a different matter, but that is very important. He's talking about the kinds of governance reforms, and he was the one over the years who talked about the important issues of decentralization and local elections in order to pursue the broader goals of economic reform. And so, understanding this, I think, is really key for all of the countries in the region.
I would add just along those lines, 2 things. One, unlike when you were in Tashkent promoting democracy, Russia's really a player in soft power projection in Central Asia, as is China. In a lot of ways, Russia is mimicking. I've learned this at lunches with Dawn on Wednesdays, as we look at what Russia's doing throughout the globe in terms of using institutions that are very parallel to our own NGOs and election observation missions and things like that. The other is, and I feel like this is a little bit, like the character in the movie The Graduate, 2 words: social media. Social media is a place where Even in lockdown environments, media environments, we're seeing very much activity. We're seeing the use of multimedia and the use of social media to mobilize along a lot of lines, and that's where the action is. So I'm going to go to some audience questions, and the first one that we have is from Frank Maraccione, who studies Chinese policy in the region. Which countries could be the most relevant partners for an enhanced U.S. role? What do you think the U.S. can contribute to the region that China cannot? Anybody want to grab that one? Jen.
So I think there's a lot here. I mean, look, a lot of the countries in Central Asia, of course, they look to the China model as like this miracle, right? Like, okay, we don't have to engage in like substantial economic reforms, political reforms, and yet we can get economic growth. But I think Central Asian republics understand the inherent limitations. The Central Asian republics very well understand what's going on in Xinjiang. Of course, they're not going to speak openly about these issues, but I think it's quite heartbreaking for so many people to see this. And they understand that, is this a model that they really want? In some ways, they're able to take that, draw on certain elements of it, but mimicking it completely, I don't think is in anyone's cards. So, looking at issues like education, like human capital, do Central Asian republics really want to send all of their young people to study in China? I'm not convinced that's the case, right? So, I think education is being one important role. Are the investments from BRI really what countries thought they would be? There was a lot of talk, but I think that the great disappointment that we see, especially in post-Mirziyoyev Uzbekistan, right, is we're going to open up and all this investment's going to come flooding in. And, a lot of that is the fault of the Uzbeks for not moving forward, I think, on the reforms as they had promised. But I do think that there was real disappointment, from the U.S. Now, of course, the U.S. can't engineer firms like the same way that China can to come and invest, and state-driven development doesn't work the same way. But I really do think that there's opportunities to engage more, not just on these governance issues, but on these economic and education issues.
And another thing I noticed in my news feed yesterday was that Tokayev has announced that he's reorienting the Balashak training program, which has, basically sent thousands of now mid-level bureaucrats to the West to get training. He's reorienting that on Russia and Russian universities. And I don't know if that's
Uzbekistan has a similar program. We've looked at the data. Actually, Navbahor and I looked at some of this data, and the Uzbek government has its own now equivalent to Bolshak, a reinvigorated one. They had one years before. They have a new one, and when you look at the data that they publish on their website, all of the people are going to to Russia. So many of the students are going to Russia, and not to the United States, and not to China. So I do think that for whatever reason, but I do think this is an opportunity.
Dick?
Yeah, I think there's something really important that we have to think of right at this time about policy, and that's how is the United States going to react in a policy way to what happened in Kazakhstan. I know for a fact that the United States government, the Biden administration, is still debating immediate policy. I've been in meetings within the last couple of days about this, and there's no consensus yet. The countries are going out the region, the 5 countries, the 4 other countries, let's say, are going to watch very, very closely. And if we come down too hard, or if we pull back from Kazakhstan, that's going to very much influence our status in the region. It's going to be very important. Look, we need to balance realpolitik with our ideology. We stand for human rights and democracy, and we can never forget that. But we need to find essential and proper ways to move that forward. And public finger wagging and naming and shaming is counterproductive. It's not going to help us in the region, I'm afraid.
Bahor.
agree with Ambassador Hoagland that, naming and shaming isn't always effective. Looking at the fact that the security services across Central Asia are still after people who get funded by the United States, who work closely with the U.S. organizations, we can totally, come to that conclusion that, despite the fact that we're now celebrating this great cooperation between Central Asia governments and Washington, America still has that problem, the lack of trust. So if you're trained by the United States, if you're an organization funded by the United States, you're still in trouble, mostly, across the region. In Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, as we see, Kyrgyzstan had a stronger civil society 10 years ago. Tajikistan had a civil society a decade ago. They don't have that anymore. Why? And that really needs to be really deeply analyzed when reconsidering, U.S. Strategy towards the region. Just to add very quickly, the Mirziyoyev administration, I would argue, is more open. Like Uzbekistan is more open than ever to work with the United States. When I said Central Asia wants more active America, I really meant that because, there are enough pro-Americans, there are enough liberals still in the Uzbek government, for example, as much as there are, pro-Russians and pro-Chinese even. So you need to engage them in ways that, yes, you have these bilaterals, you have this dialogue, various platforms going on with Central Asian governments, but you don't really have anything that goes deeper. And that applies to the promotion of human rights and freedom as well. So you need to engage them deeper so that you can develop nuanced approaches. And why are Central Asians now going to Russia and China? There is an economic factor there. And there is also another factor. It's not easy to come to the United States. US doesn't really issue visas, for example, in Uzbekistan, really. So many prefer to go to Russia and China because it's cheaper, it's easier to study there. If you expand exchange programs, for example, I know a lot of people are quite cynical about that as well, but you need to create opportunities for more Central Asians to come and study here. I mean, that's a long-term investment if you want to make, but that's one of the reasons why they're going. They're not going there because they want to be like Chinese or Russians. They're going there because that's the option they have.
Or they could stay at home and go to new universities that are being created.
Yes, exactly, which are mainly being opened by China and Russia as well.
It's not just shifting everything to Russia. The main development there is that they're shifting them to the new school program that exists under Nazarbayev University. As a trustee, I've followed this closely. They are domesticating the Bolshoi program. We should their higher education, their school programs, and so on. We're still single-mindedly focusing on getting them abroad. We could be a very quick note, and that is how from generalities to specifics. I would suggest the way to go right now, immediately, state, is to convene a meeting of C5+1 that is opened by the President of the United States. It takes place in Washington, and have the RMs, if they're named, Dick Hoagland, thank you for raising that important issue. If we have ambassadors, have them prepare for that meeting by beginning what can we provide? And what is in your security interest and what is in our interest? And then parallel to it, shouldn't be done totally in the darkness, is a similar but quiet discussion in NATO. For peace, all the Central Asians, they were sending people to programs and seminars. They were getting training in 100 areas. It was very productive. What's the status of that today? What should it be in them tomorrow? We do that, we're back in the game.
All right, I've got a couple of questions that actually play right into that discussion. Number one, numerous panelists made statements for a strategy that includes the needs of the states and for government and government in general. How can the U.S. make sure the general public's needs and interests are also addressed in this strategy? And then one that sort of plays off of that a little bit from Ambassador Alan Mustard. In the 1980s, the U.S. government quit large-scale funding of university scholarships for foreign students. China moved into that space in Central Asia. Your thoughts on this? including this in the U.S. strategy. Jen, you look like you're, yep.
So, I mean, this is exactly why, with all due respect, Fred Starr, I don't think that the security first, that might win the hearts and minds of the states. But I think we also have to think about the people. And this is where I think putting not security and stability, but also prosperity has to be the heart. This is what people care about, right? And if we're going to look at this instability that we've seen in Central Asia, you can look at all of these issues and, there's an economic bullseye on so many of these issues that have taken shape. And if we care about perceptions of the United States, I do think that this is a positive sum outcome that government share, citizens share, and it puts citizens, I think, at the heart of this. Number two, education. Yes, the U.S. has made massive investments into the American University of Central Asia. In Kyrgyzstan, it's helped a lot of people, throughout the region, but mostly in Kyrgyzstan. Nazarbayev, that university in Kazakhstan serves citizens of Kazakhstan. The largest population in Central Asia is in Uzbekistan. I think that the U.S. would be, if we look at what went well in Afghanistan, I would argue that the investment that paid off the most was education. And education had a transformational impact. And the U.S. has this comparative advantage. I'm going to keep saying it. And this is how we put people first. This is how we put prosperity first. And this is how we put, positive sum relations. I know that the Uzbeks, for example, want this very, very badly. It's a low-hanging fruit, easy win for everyone.
Any other comments?
Yeah, you've created a false dichotomy. No one's arguing against what you just said. The question is, how do you get them engaged to the level that is in our interest on those issues? And that requires more than we're doing, and it requires a degree of candor about and communication about security matters that has not been present.
I don't disagree with you there, and I don't think this is a false dichotomy. I just think that when we have a strategy that says security and stability and says nothing about prosperity,
no one has. Yeah. We don't have such a.
Okay, let me redirect this a little bit. We've got a question, and I actually feel this sometimes when I bring up C5+1 issues and I'm dealing with embassies here in Washington. Does Central Asia want to be dealt with as a region? Do these countries want to be dealt with as a group, or would they prefer to be establish bilateral relations with the United States? We are very much for the group principle, but sometimes we see maybe competition. Fred?
We're not very much for it. We've tipped our hat to it, but done very little to implement it. Let me say, for years they were not. Right. Understandably, as new sovereignties, just like the United States after independence, we wanted to go our own way, brushed everyone else aside, and so on. And then later on, we started re-engaging. And they have all reached a level of self-confidence. Whether it's fully warranted or not is another question, but they have. And now they want not to their sovereignty, but to build a second story on it. And the second story is regional. And the history of this regionalization in Central Asia is extremely interesting. And it involves expeditions to Singapore to analyze and discuss and meet with all the top people in ASEAN. It involves study of the Nordic Council. It involves meetings at the president. Goes all, and these have been frequent, and it calls meetings of women, by the way, women in civil society organizations. These have already taken place on a regional level with presidential support and education, research, all sorts of things. This is all happening before us. It's just that we've taken a rather passive approach. They've gone ahead of us, and we have to catch up. This is not against anyone, by the way. Rather than following behind it, we should not do, but we should make clear that we're ready to support this and to work with you on it tomorrow morning.
Okay, Navahor and then Dick.
Well, they want both, Gavin. They want to be treated as a region, as a legitimate part of the world, or, with common interests and priorities. But they also, each Central Asian, country wants to be seen within its own unique qualities and unique positions. So they prefer both, and they love it when you call them unique. They love it when you call them, something different than anybody else. But the United States is not going to win the hearts and minds in Central Asia by, U.S. top-level diplomats going to Tashkent or elsewhere, making plof and posting pictures, or having a nice Samarkand, Registan background pictures. I mean, those things are really cheap PR at this point. You mentioned social media. I didn't mention social media before because it's such a normalcy now. It's nothing new. Yes, Central Asians are on social media. So what? What is happening in those conversations? What you hear a lot in those conversations nowadays is the lack of energy across the region. Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan had massive outage this week, and millions in Uzbekistan are still living without gas and, power now as we speak. So talk about, energy policy, lack of this is a regional issue. And then, of course, corruption. Now we hear President Biden talking about anti-corruption efforts. He talks about commitment, in terms of fighting authoritarianism. He never mentioned Central Asia. We haven't heard anything about Central Asia in his speeches yet. So how about that? I mean, I would really take that into account. When Central Asians hear President Biden speak about things, obviously they relate because they live in those environments where corruption is deep, when they really need help fighting corruption. And yet we don't really, as I said earlier, we don't hear deeper, more engaging conversations about that. Engage the government, but also the public. And the best way to engage the public is, of course, engaging the media community. And I know that you're going to ask this question, what can U.S. do, or what can it change in its strategy in the coming years? It would be support media freedom. And supporting media freedom should not and will not threaten the governments in the region. They need to understand that. You need to have that conversation with the governments that media freedom, press freedom, professional, responsible media in the region will just take them forward. And that's also not happening. If U.S. doesn't support this and its partners, its Western partners, nobody else will. And that's something unique about the United States. And that's something that I would really, really strongly suggest in terms of, renewing U.S. strategy for the region. Media freedom, supporting
we're running short on time, and you've already anticipated my lightning round outro question, which is, what one thing would you add or change to the strategy going forward? So Dick, I'm going to let you make your comment, and then you can answer the question of what one thing you would change or add to the strategy going forward.
Well, actually, my comment is going to take care of both of those, Gavin. I want to go back to what Fred was saying about the regional organization. Look, they've already started that on their own in 2018 with the leadership of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They had a summit. They had a C5. It wasn't a C5 plus one. It wasn't a C5 plus Japan. It wasn't a C5 plus South Korea. It was a C5. And they followed that up. The change in government, the change in presidency in Uzbekistan sort of slowed that down for a while. And now, inevitably, the issues in Kazakhstan are going to slow it down once again. But they do have a date set for their next summit. The one thing we need to do in U.S. policy, and I hope that Les Vigoury is still listening, what we need to do is fully, openly support and promote the regional organization on the model, as Fred said, of ASEAN or the Nordic Council or many, many others, because that will make them stronger among themselves. They don't lose sovereignty, they gain strength. That's important.
Fred, what would you add or change in the current strategy going forward? Lightning round.
Well, I agree with Dick Hoagland 100%. We always have on this. But in addition to been passive and mechanical on this. It's not that we're against it. We've just been mechanical and sort of bureaucratic, and we've not asked them bluntly what what can we do to support? But a second matter, I think, and that is, let's have some daylight on the security relationship, the whole issue there. What are we doing? What is NATO up to now? What has it done in the past? What should it do in the future? How does that support or not support our policy that state is pursuing? Or are these coming from two totally different entities that don't talk with each other? They should be mutually reinforcing. That's my point. The security and the civil programs should each support the other, and that isn't the case today.
All right, so Nabahor, you've already told us what your answer is, so I'm going to let Jen take us out with the one thing we need to change in U.S. strategy going forward.
So it's doing exactly what both Dick and Fred suggested, first on the regional integration, but two, building on what Fred just said in terms of security. One of the things we haven't talked about at all is Afghanistan. And Fred has made a long-standing argument, which is the smartest argument I've seen about the need to integrate Afghanistan into this region. And so I would put Afghanistan into this strategy. Not just only the security dimension is huge, of course. So I would have a, is it C5, C6, right? And I know, Fred, that you've argued with this. I'm 100% with you. And it's even more important now than ever. If we want to reach the people of Afghanistan, look at how the Central Asian republics are approaching this right now. And I think if you take your glasses off, all of us in this world, it's going to surprise you. They are confident in dealing with Afghanistan. They're more confident in dealing with Afghanistan than we are. Uzbekistan has set up a huge humanitarian hub in Termez. If we want to deal with the people of Afghanistan, we might not like the government, but I hope that we continue to support the people of Afghanistan. So I think making this strategy actually include Afghanistan in a very serious way. Afghanistan doesn't want to be part of, historically has not wanted to be part of AFPAC. Many Afghans want to be part of Central Asia and see this strategy is very important to them. So let's put Afghanistan into the strategy.
Okay, we are out of time, but even more importantly, we seem to have reached consensus, which I think is a wonderful way to end a very thoughtful, very engaging panel. So I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank our audience for the questions, and everybody have a great weekend.
You too.
Thanks very much.
You too.
It was
Thanks
excellent.
all.